So first, what is local food? Now, 3 years ago, USDA ERS, Economic Research Service, released a report, and they released lots of reports, but this one was a review of what was known at that point in time on local food. And one of the things they mentioned in the report, which is still true today, is that there really is not a universally accepted definition of local food. And what I've shown here in the picture is a few different examples of different definitions that are out there. The first one, which is shown with the 30, I should say these are all depicted as Washington, D.C. is the center of this picture. So that's a 30-mile radius. And that's a local definition that I've seen at one of the farmers markets in upstate New York, that if you have to be within 30 miles to sell at the farmers market. So there's one definition. The 100-mile diet made a bit of a splash a few years ago. That's another commonly thrown around definition. And then this 400 miles is actually within a specific USDA program. It's only a definition within that program on supplying, I think, schools. So 3 very different definitions in terms of their geographic scale, and no agreement on which one's the right one. Another way to look at this is based on what's the model of farm production that you have. Who is actually marketing local products? And this typology comes out of this USDA ERS report. And they differentiate between 2 different types. They call one farm to consumer, but you could also consider that just direct sales to people. And the other is farm to business or institution. That's also sometimes called intermediated sales. And they come in a variety of flavors. So if you're talking about direct marketing, this could be a farmer's market, it could be a community-supported agriculture system, it could be a farm stand, it could be a pick-your-own operation, and there's lots of other variations. These are just 4 very typical ones. And then you've got farm to business or institution, where you're selling through restaurants, farms are selling to retail stores, they're going through schools and hospitals. And these are different channels. What distinguishes these is these are not typical commodity channels. That's what's very different about this. Now, certainly since the time this work was published a few years ago, to the present, there's been a bit more work and a bit more questioning of, well, how important is local? How environmentally conscious is local? How beneficial is local? And a paper that came out in 2010 tried to differentiate local from regional food, because they're often used sometimes interchangeably or at least together. And there is some difference. The sort of obvious difference is shown here on the right, where we're talking about a difference in geographic scope. So with local being very close in proximity to where consumers live, regional being somewhere in between national and local, and national, of course, being sort of continental-wide. You could put global on there if you wanted. So there's this sort of middle ground here. And what was noted as being potentially significant about this middle ground is that you might have some opportunity to get economies of scale that you don't have if you're purely focused on a local scale. So this could be in terms of the volume of food you can produce. There's more that you can produce in a region that is multiple states than if you're talking maybe only about multiple counties. Management of natural resources often happens in multi-state areas, or needs to happen in multi-state areas. And that's another potential advantage of working at this scale. There may be efficiencies because you're talking about operations that are serving a larger number of consumers and can get economies of scale. And then there's also diversity, in that you have a wider range of climate zones within a region, so there's less restrictiveness in terms of providing a regional diet versus a local one. So why does all of this matter? And I'm going to read through this list and preface it with the fact that there isn't a consensus that I've seen in the literature on how many of these claims are true, or how true are they, when are they true. But these are claims that have all been made, and we'll go through them. So the first is that it's fresher, in part because it's closer to the point of production. It doesn't take that long to get there. Maybe for the same reasons, it's more nutritious. There's less loss of nutrient content in the transportation process, that it's tastier, that it's safer because it's a disaggregated food system, or that because you have this special knowledge with the producer, that it's important for keeping farmers farming and supporting local economies, that it might have less energy use because there's reduced distance of transport, and for the same reason that you have lower greenhouse gas emissions, and that it promotes some sort of connection to food. And I would say that there's certainly some work that's been done in this area, and the conclusions have generally been, well, there may be a benefit, but it's probably modest. And many of the rest are they're open questions at this point. And the question is, what is important about local food, or what is important about regional food that we actually want to promote it? Because obviously the food system has been moving towards a more national and more global scale for at least most of the last century. Now, one thing I want to mention, you may have heard about this. This paper made a splash when it was first released, but the point is still well taken. It's called Avoiding the Local Trap. And the idea of the local trap, which I think people are less likely to fall into as they become more familiar with what is potentially good about local food and what might be problematic, is that it can be seen as an alternative that is more sustainable and more just potentially than the current food system, and therefore we need to promote it. And what this article really addressed in detail was, when are there cases where this simply may not be true? And to avoid promoting any particular scale just because that's the right scale, and rather looking at to what degree does a local food system or a regional food system play some critical role in getting us from this current system, which is maybe less ecologically sustainable or less economically sustainable or less just than we want, to this alternative system that's better. So with that leads me to two big questions that motivate my work, one of which we're going to talk about in some detail. The first is, what is the place of local and regional food in the U.S. food system? And that's a question we're not going to come to a final conclusion about today, but I think it's the big question that is the important one if you're trying to decide, well, how much do you promote local food? How much do you promote regional food? Does it deserve some subsidy or special treatment? The question that we will address in some detail, and which is part, I think, of the process to getting us to an answer to this question, is what capacity does a location have to produce a local diet? It will nowhere, it certainly won't get us the whole answer, but it will give us part of the answer. So, we're going to address this in two parts. We'll start with the food shed analysis. And I want to talk a bit about the funding streams. This work was an evolutionary process, and it started back in the early 2000s with some hatch money dedicated to the Cornell Experiment Station and some money from the department I was housed in, and then went on to be supported by a grant from the USDA National Research Initiative, the Small and Mid-Sized Farms Program, and more recently by a grant from the Kellogg Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And the work that I'm going to present today is mostly from this project and a little bit of the early years of this. But you can expect to see more. I'll speak a little bit more about the directions for this project later on in my talk. And this just gives you a timeline for the evaluation, starting with a New York focus and going to a focus on more locations. More on that in a little bit. So I want to talk about the origin of the term food shed, because it's a term that has gained some traction with the sort of explosion of the local food movement in 2006, 2007. But most people don't know how old it is. It was coined in the late 1920s. And the prologue here is that in the early 20s, there was the threat of a nationwide railroad strike. And it's supposed to be that the big four unions were going to go on strike, and it was going to shut down movement of products all over the country. So since at that time rail traffic was so important relative to truck traffic, this was a big concern. Well, the strike was averted, and the crisis was averted, but it prompted a study of the New York City food supply that was published in the late 20s. It's titled How Great Cities Are Fed, and it was written by Walter Hedden, who was the chief of the Port Authority of New York City at that time. And there were 8 million people in the 5 boroughs of New York City in 1920. And one of the motivations for this was they did not know how food was getting to the city. It was, but they didn't know how much was coming by different routes and from where. So that was the impetus. And here's just a selection of the chapter titles: the revolutionary activities of the refrigerator car, the geography of food terminals and food industries. These are, you can see some of the historicalness here. You know, we don't have refrigerated boxcars are not a new technology these days. But the one I want to get to is that the term food sheds is coined here, along with the term milk sheds. And basically, after the term got mentioned in this book, it went into suspended animation for about 6 or 7 decades and got resurrected in the 90s, first in an article by Arthur Getz, in this permaculture activist, and then it got fleshed out in this article, Coming into the Food Shed, which some of you may have read, by Kloppenberg and others, published in the mid-90s. And the point of that article was to cast a food shed as a way of thinking about getting to an alternative system that's better than what we've got, and that thinking about where food comes from and how it's produced is part of that process. And then in the recent years, we've seen a few attempts at different food shed analyses. I'll talk about the ones for New York. Incidentally, we've got an early food shed map here in the lower right. That's a map of apple shipments into the Boston market in the late 19-teens and early 1920s. So the pies show you where apples were produced, and this little slice here is showing how much went to Boston. Point being, there was cross-continental movement of food at that time, at least for some of these more storable commodities. So before we go into any findings of the food shed work, I'm going to give you just one schematic to discuss what the basic approach is. And it's essentially a way of trying to make a marriage between a lot of different secondary data, process it, and come up with some interesting findings about what's the capacity to produce food, not just for a whole state or a whole region, but at the scale of individual population centers. So how did this happen? Well, on the production side, we've already got data, geospatial data, on soils from the soil survey. We've got data on land cover, which is what the surface of the Earth looks like from space. That's collected by U.S. Geological Survey and others. And we've got data on where people live. Urban areas are defined by the Census Bureau, and they find out how many people live in those areas. And that's sort of the root input, the raw input that goes into the model. And another piece of input, which I'll talk about in some depth tomorrow, is this submodel that answers the question, how much food can you produce on the average acre, given different types of diets? Because the soils data don't tell you anything about diets. Land cover doesn't tell you anything about diets. Population doesn't tell you anything about diets or land. So this is sort of the missing piece that helps you translate the information you have on sort of general soil productivity and where land that's in agriculture is located, and translate it into feeding people. Now the model's very simple. It divides the world into 2 places, which is much more simplified than the current food system is. We've got production zones and we've got population centers. And food essentially gets transported from the production zone to the population center. And what happens is the productive capacity of these zones in terms of how many people you could feed per unit of land gets fed into the model, and the food need of the population centers gets fed into the model. And the model, there's an optimization software used to answer the question, how would the food be allocated? We'll talk about how that happens in a couple minutes. But it produces some output that you can then create maps with and see what would these potential food sheds look like, and you can summarize the data in more traditional table form. So to give you an idea, a bit of what New York looks like and a bit of what the input data look like, I've got 2 maps here. This is land cover of New York State, and the dark green is forest. For those of you who have a little bit of New York knowledge, this is Adirondack State. It's not really a park, it's a amalgam of different landowners, but it's protected. And light green is agriculture. So you can see agriculture's mainly in the center part of the state, running down some of the river valleys. And this is New York City. All the developed land is shown in pink. And then the graph on the right shows soil productivity using corn silage as an indicator crop, if you will. And it's chosen because New York is a major dairy state. We have lots of information on how productive soils are for corn silage, so it serves as a proxy. And the darker colors indicate more productive soils, which are located largely in the same places that that most of the agriculture is located. And what these determine is where agriculture is located and what the relative productivity is. Now, on the people side, the question with mapping food sheds is food sheds to what? Is this food shed to a city? Is it to a town? Is it to a neighborhood? You could really choose lots of different endpoints, but the endpoint I chose were urbanized areas and urban clusters. These are census entities that are essentially multiple municipalities, or in some case, portions of municipalities, and it's basically defined by population density. But so they're a nice proxy for centers of population. And if you look at this in terms of how many people live where in New York State, well, 2/3 of the population live down here. And that's about 12 million people in New York City and the surrounding counties. And then everybody else is distributed around the rest of the state. So it's very asymmetric. Now, there were two approaches that were used here to try to estimate what a potential food shed might look like. And the first method is what you could call the minimum food miles method. So it's essentially taking the available agricultural land and allocating it so that it's feeding essentially people in the shortest possible distance. Now, there's a wrinkle in this because New York State has 19 million people and a relatively modest agricultural land base, so it can't meet nearly all of its population. So the model allocates the productive capacity that's available to meet as much of the demand as it can, and as a result of the model, it tends to favor places that are closer to agricultural land than places that are further away. But that's essentially the basis of the model, and it's known in optimization research as the classic transportation problem. And there are variations on it if you wanted to look at more complicated models, but this is a very sort of first-run approach at doing this. So a few results. Well, first I'll start with some of the overall summary results. These are tabular results, and I'll focus on what's in the yellow columns here. And these are summaries of the capacity for the state as a whole to meet food needs, and then some summaries of the different sizes of cities. So New York City is in a class by itself. There's no other city like it, certainly in the state. It's by far the largest. Then you've got urbanized areas, these are mid-sized cities. They range from about 100,000 people to about 1 million people. And then you've got urban clusters, which are smaller cities. These are 50,000 people or so. And what the study found was that overall, you've got enough land in the state that, in theory, could meet about 1/3 of the food needs of the state, following a diet that could technically be supplied based on what's actually produced in the region. Now, it moves around, but a lot of the fluid milk is indeed produced in the region. And there's a large amount of egg production in the region. Then from there, it starts to get smaller and smaller, with shellfish and chicken and turkey being kind of in the middle, and then lamb and beef and pork being pretty low in terms of what is produced relative to what is consumed, though higher than you might have expected. We can discuss that in the Q&A if you wish on why that is. But I want to wrap this section up with a few caveats, some general conclusions, and then some caveats. The first is that animal agriculture really dominates the land base in the Northeast. That's obvious from this study. And there's a wide range in self-reliance ratios. So, from dairy, which is almost 3/4, to down to food groups that are, 7%. So the region's definitely a net food importer. Absolutely no surprise. It has 70 million people and 24 million acres of land. It's going to be a net food importer. But there are some caveats, and it's the caveats where things really get interesting. So the first is seasonality of production. And I didn't have time to put in some data on this, but if you look at the seasonality of when foods are shipped out of the Northeast, for some of these fruits and vegetables, the window might just be, it could be 6 weeks, it could be 2 months. It's a really narrow window. And for that window, there's product being shipped all over the place. So it has tremendous production for a short period of time. And that seasonality is something that you don't get just by looking at these average numbers. The second is the effect of aggregation, and I mentioned that already, that when you look at a food group, there could be members of that food group that have very small self-sufficiency and others that have a very high self-sufficiency. Though if you want to look at those data are, they may be in the appendix of the paper that was prepared presenting this work. It's not published yet, it's in review. And the last thing is that with the livestock, bear in mind that the livestock feed is not necessarily regional. If it's pasture that's grazed there, that's obviously regional. I would say almost all of the forage crops that are produced are used regionally. But when it comes to concentrates, so corn grain and soybean meal and anything that moves around a lot, that may or may not be produced in the region. So what does that mean? Is a food regional if it was fed in the region, but it was fed off feed that was produced elsewhere? It's sort of an open question. So to interpret what this means, you need to consider some of these caveats. So where does this leave us? Well, I want to make a couple comments to put this in context with the situation in the Midwest. I've got some work on the Kellogg project that's actually looking at Michigan, so I have a state, but I only had very preliminary data ready, so I didn't want to share it. But I can say, generally speaking, it's far different than the Northeast. Climate's similar, but the population density is lower than it is. There's a much larger area and density of land in agriculture than in the Northeast. And as a result, there's going to be greater biological capacity to meet food needs. But that raises the question, well, what about beyond biological capacity? What's likely to happen? What's the most valuable use of the land? Those are the questions that I think I want to leave you with, because those, I think, are the questions that are going to help answer what's the place of this local food, what's the place of regional food in the food system. So within the Food Prints and Food Sheds project, we're working on getting some models for 3 different states of interest. So apart from New York, there's Michigan, Mississippi, and New Mexico. So stay tuned for food shed analyses of those states in the future. Also, there was modeling work done for the Northeast U.S, and I'll present some of that tomorrow in the seminar in Worcester, not on food sheds, but on the land requirements of diet. And the dissemination through papers is ongoing. With the Enhancing Food Security of the Northeast with Sustainable Regional Food Systems project, we're conducting a food print or land requirements of diet model of the Northeast. And then there's this interdisciplinary team of modelers doing supply chain modeling and lots of other cool stuff. So keep an eye on this project for more detail to try to dig into this question of why is regional important. I guess that's where I'll stop. Yes. Thank you.